Just normal voice. Well, now I do. Now I hear a
That
feedback.
means it's working.
Yeah, now I can hear it, yes.
Okay. Okay, get ready to tell the people,
All right.
be patient, okay? Okay, talk to the people.
Yes, welcome to my show, and please be patient for a minute or two while I set up Facebook for this live broadcast.
Perfect. Okay, refresh. All right, we wait for it to refresh. Good, you're going down. Let's wait for it to load. Keep going. And there you keep going. And share. And share now.
And when do I start?
This has been shared to all your friends have just got a notice that you're on the air. So say hello to your friends.
So I'm live.
You're live.
All right. Well, welcome to the 15th installment of Studies in a Dying Culture. It's July 27th, 2019, and this is your host, Ralph Dumain. This is my first live broadcast on Facebook. It will be permanently archived the audio will be permanently archived at Think Twice Radio at thinktwiceradio.com/domain/domain.html, and domain is spelled D-U-M-A-I-N. Also, the video will be preserved on the Think Twice Radio Facebook webpage, but only the audio will appear on the actual Think Twice Radio website. So, I'm broadcasting from the home of the future in South Buffalo. I'm tempted to make a few remarks about South Buffalo, but I will just say that my mother lived here for a time in the 1940s, and she found it rather hostile and bigoted. As to whether it's improved since then, well, we'll discuss that some other time. Now, this is an especially good date for this broadcast. July 27th is the date that Baruch Spinoza, the first rootless cosmopolitan, blessed be he, was excommunicated at the age of 23 by the Jewish community of Amsterdam in 1656. The Stalinist campaign against rootless cosmopolitans, which was a code word for Jewish intellectuals, was initiated in December 1946. But I picked July 27th to celebrate what I have coined Rootless Cosmopolitans Day, because belonging is highly overrated, and we, whatever our background, need a day of our own. And this installment is titled Love in Intellect, and I dedicate it to Juan in Washington, D.C., who faces the dilemmas I will discuss here, and who is the type of person amongst my listeners who matters the most. Now, to recap about my series, Studies in a Dying Culture is inspired by the work of Christopher Caldwell, a brilliant autodidact who was killed fighting fascism in Spain in 1937. He authored a series of studies titled Studies in a Dying Culture, facing the crisis of capitalism's descent into fascism in his time. My broadcasts do not necessarily focus on the negative, but we too face a crisis, and my goal here is to contrast what is alive in thought and what is dead in the world. Now, for further research, you can check out my website, autodidactproject.org, which is spelled auto as an automobile, didact, D-I-D-A-C-T, project.org. All small letters, one stream of characters, autodidactproject.org. There's also one of my blogs, reasonsociety.blogspot.com. Now, within the next couple weeks, I will add a web page detailing the contents of this broadcast with links to the sources and quotations I use here, plus those that I could not squeeze in this time frame. I also refer you to a previous installment from May the 17th, 2015, titled Adorno for Autodidacts, for which there's also a web page as well as an archive broadcast. This was my original springboard for what I'm going to convey here. Now, after all these preliminaries, we can finally begin. So here is part one, Dilemma of the Critical Intellect. Let me begin with a quote from William Blake's prophetic poem, Milton. There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day if rightly placed. Now, this is what we seek here, that dialectical moment of renewal that transcends organized dehumanization. And thus my theme, love and intellect, because only these two, playing off one another, only by these two are we able to chart a way through and out of bitterness and stagnation. I'm addressing the dilemma of the critically thinking individual, especially the working class outsider, the one with no institutional connection or power base, or maybe even any base of support of any kind. This person is anonymous and unacknowledged, adrift amidst the ignorance of both the rich and the poor, in some cases bereft of satisfactory interpersonal relationships, perhaps not understood or respected by family, parents, siblings, spouses, or by lovers, friends, neighbors, or the community. There is a tendency to isolation, but isolation can breed dysfunction and stagnation. I want to give two examples of people that I have dealt with. My ex-companion's previous companion was a nerdy black atheist who had a very unhappy childhood and upbringing. He was completely alienated from his family. He couldn't really relate satisfactorily to other people. He was in his own world of various interests. But as an isolated person, he unfortunately was a case of arrested development. Both his personality and mind never matured. Another example I can think of was a woman I corresponded with once, a frustrated, bitter, misanthropic, but highly intelligent young black woman, actually not even out of her teen years. She couldn't see any prospects for the improvement of people. She once said, or wrote to me, "Why would I want something better for other people when they don't want it for themselves?" I attempted to convey a perspective by which she could escape the dead end of bitterness, but I failed to do so. She became furious with me, thinking that I was accusing me of just slinging empty platitudes. But I hate platitudes, and I do not like preachers. I tried to respect her situation, but I could not get through. There are no guarantees, but there is a vital lesson. You must do justice to people's experience and people's suffering. The critical thinker who lacks connections is invisible in a world organized against thought. I also am concerned about the double invisibility of minorities, and I think especially of black Americans. Popular culture is organized against the expression of individual perspective. The culture industry has billions of dollars invested in stereotyping, and even with an extended range of social types depicted in the media, and even the phenomenon of crossover stereotyping that you find in sitcoms, where people take on roles and stereotypes opposite to what you would expect of them, or what you would have expected of them in the past. This doesn't solve the problem. Everything is a type. Even nerds are a type. But nerds aren't real people, as you see them on television or the movies. The actual individual perception that the exceptional individual has of the various segments of society that one faces and the assumptions of the different groups one deals with, that individual perception is effectively excluded from the mass media. So how do we address the problem of social isolation? Well, there are two aspects to this. One, of course, is a support system, which we can't really get into detail here, but I will say that it's very important for raising children to find a support system so that they just don't run with the crowd and follow the consciousness dulling aspects of popular culture, but but are stimulated and have people who will feed them and help further their passions and interests instead of terrorizing them into conformity. The second way of addressing the problem of social isolation, historically speaking, is literacy, reading, the escape route for so many frustrated but exceptional, in fact, sometimes very poor people or oppressed people. Now, engaging the intellectual heritage is a problem in itself, and that I think will have to wait till the next broadcast. But the dilemma we face and the goal that I think we should pursue is to escape entrapment in bitterness and stagnation. My two guiding principles are love and intellect. They drive one another on. Sometimes they clash, but they're inseparable. Love gives us motivation, and without it, the mind will die too. The intellect delves deeper and farther than immediate impressions and beyond the boundaries of interpersonal relations within existing social arrangements. Intellect sees the tragedy of what should be, but is not. Intellect requires imagination, because without imagination, thinking is sterile. There's a quote that I really like. It was been attributed to the surrealist Paul Éluard, but in actual fact, he was quoting someone who was quoting someone. And the quote is, "There is another world, but it is in this one." There is a necessary experience of closeness and distance. One must occupy both vantage points simultaneously. Positivity is insufficient. Preaching and ideology don't work. To be positive, one must be honest and very specific about what one is positive about. And by the process that I've outlined here, one can build up intellectual authority and counterpose it to mental weakness, including the mental weakness of intellectuals. Intellectual authority is not dependent on status. Those seeking intellectual support will turn to literary and philosophical sources for alternative perspectives. And there can be many pitfalls to this. But after having spent many hours adding this to my outline, I realized I have to save this for my next installment of Studies in a Dying Culture. And now let's move on to part 2, the critical intellect versus superstition. It is effectively impossible to argue with survival-driven illusions, especially religious ones. I'm thinking of two different types of superstition. One is the superstition that you will see in the adherents of traditional religions. And two, do-it-yourself New Age spirituality, where you could say that in that way of thinking, reality is what works for me. Another hallmark of New Ageism is positivity, that thinking positively will make the universe is on your side, and thinking positively will result in positive results. First, I will address traditional religious beliefs, and from this, I will quote from Karl Marx's Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, written between December 1843 and January 1844. Many passages are extracted from this essay, sometimes quoted separately, not connected with one another. I will quote a very key extract of this long essay that appears near the beginning of it. And here is the quote, some of which you may be familiar with, most of it probably not. "The foundation of irreligious criticism is, man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Religion is, indeed, the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again, But man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, state, society. This state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world, because they are an inverted world. Religion is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its spiritual point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The struggle against religion is, therefore, indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is, therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Now, the phrase that's most often quoted, usually in isolation, is religion is the opium of the people. It's the most quoted, but actually, I think, the least interesting of these passages. And there are many interesting passages in this essay, only some of which one large extract of which I've quoted. But here's what I consider the key phrase. Religion is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its spiritual point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. That is, this is how experience is filtered, interpreted, and justified by the decent and the indecent, the honest and the dishonest, the exploited and the exploiter. It is the mental universe within which the uneducated and the badly educated orient themselves in their relations with others. It is not just the opium of the people, which is just one function of religion for the dispossessed. It is the circumscribed mental universe of the people. And this is what you will bang your head against in vain if you attempt to oppose it. Now I want to say a few things about New Age superstition. Here, too, the critical intellectual perspective is opposed, with accusations of negativity and failing to be, quote, unquote, open-minded. And this is what I had in mind when I presented what I called Adorno's best breakup quotes in my podcast on Adorno and critical theory in 2015. The phrase Adorno's best breakup quotes probably won't strike you funny if you don't know who Adorno is. It's a personal in-joke that only I understand until I explain it to others. Because this isn't the kind of thing that you would engage in your significant other when you're breaking up with them. But actually, I sent the quote that I'm about to read to my soon-to-be ex-partner, who herself was committed to New Age and thinking and positivity, who herself had overcome tremendous obstacles in childhood, but was very talented and persistent, and managed to accomplish great things in spite of living in poverty in the projects and suffering the things that she suffered as a child. She would accuse me of negativity, and I made one final attempt to explain myself, and I sent her this quote. This is from Theodor W. Adorno, and it's from a lecture series which is published in a book called Metaphysics, Concepts, and Problems. This is from a lecture that he gave on the 22nd of July of 1965, and here is an extract from it. There is an American saying that there are no atheists in the trenches. The old German proverb that danger teaches us to pray points in the same direction. This argument is illogical because the situations in which people are forced to think positively simply in order to survive are themselves situations of compulsion which force people back on pure self-preservation and on thinking only what they need in order to survive in such a situation, to a point where the truth content of what they think is hopelessly undermined and utterly destroyed. It is possible that, had Beckett been in a concentration camp, he would not have written The Unnameable or Endgame, but I do not think it possible that this would have made what he wrote better or truer. The idea you will come across again and again in this context, that one has to give people something, has to give them courage. All these things are conditions which restrict the thinking of truth, but which may well bring down on someone who thinks the truth the odium of inhumanity. But I also think that this mode of thinking, this demand placed on thought, does an injustice to the people in whose honor it is ostensibly made. Although this demand is seemingly made out of a charitable concern for the victims, in fact it reduces them to the objects of a thinking which manipulates and calculates them and assumes in advance that it is giving them what they need and want. By the evaluation manifested in such ostentatiously noble injunctions, the people they pretend to serve are in reality debased. They are treated by metaphysics in fundamentally the same way as by the culture industry. If there is any way out of this hellish circle, and I would not wish to exaggerate that possibility, being well aware of the weakness and susceptibility of such consciousness, it is probably the ability of mind to assimilate, to think the last extreme of horror, and in the face of this spiritual experience, to gain mastery over it. That is little enough, for obviously such an imagination, such an ability to think extreme negativity, is not comparable to what one undergoes if one is oneself caught up in such situations. Nevertheless, I would think that in the ability not to feel manipulated, but to feel that one has gone relentlessly to the furthest extreme, there lies the only respect which is fitting, a respect for the possibility of the mind, despite everything, to raise itself, however slightly above that which is. And I think that it really gives more courage if one is not given courage and does not feel bamboozled, but has the feeling that even the worst is something which can be thought, and because it falls within reflection, does not confront me as something absolutely alien and different. I imagine that such a thought is probably more comforting than any solace, whereas solace itself is desolate, since it is always attended by its own untruth. Adorno has expressed this situation of the intellectual, critical intellectual face-to-face with survival-driven superstition in a way that I have not seen better expressed elsewhere. And this is what we face and what we basically cannot overcome. Now, part 3. This is where I sum up. The next thing I would discuss, which we'll have to wait for another broadcast, is to turn to one's intellectual heritage, which is what the generally, especially the isolated, critical, intellectually oriented person would do. This too will be a challenge. And there are many pitfalls to it. One of the many pitfalls is, of course, encountering and unfortunately being influenced by, the possibility of being influenced by the hatefulness and right-wing extremism of unjustly influential philosophers who themselves were would-be elites and lacked that sense of concern for what the average person or the average critical intellect who is not power-hungry and doesn't have a power base has to deal with. The problems of survival. I think, for example, of Nietzsche and Heidegger. When I broadcast my next installment, it could be summarized as being for William Blake and against Friedrich Nietzsche. But I can't pursue that now So instead, I'm going to close out with some more quotes. Some both pessimistic quotes and inspirational quotes to highlight what I'm attempting to communicate here. And now I'm going to turn to two more of what I call, with my little in-joke, Adorno's best breakup quotes. This one is from a book by Theodor Adorno called Minima Moralia. Condescension and thinking oneself no better are the same. To adapt to the weakness of the oppressed is to affirm in it the precondition of power, and to develop in oneself the coarseness, insensibility, and violence needed to exert domination. For the intellectual, inviolable isolation is now the only way of showing some measure of solidarity. All collaboration, all the human worth of social mixing and participation merely masks a tacit acceptance of inhumanity. It is the sufferings of men that should be shared. The smallest step toward their pleasures is one towards the hardening of their pains. Now, I can't, of course, completely agree with all of this. It's an extreme statement. But it does deal with this theme that I've mentioned about the relationship between closeness and distance. And this, of course, emphasizes distance, but not distance for the sake of misanthropy, but for the sake of preserving something. And it's a dilemma that a person can be cornered into because of, well, being up against a brick wall. I want to give you one more quote from Adorno. It's an essay called Resignation. And here's the concluding paragraph to it, with a few dots, with a few omissions. By contrast, the uncompromisingly critical thinker, who neither signs over his consciousness nor lets himself be terrorized into action, is in truth the one who does not give in. Thinking is not the intellectual reproduction of what already exists anyway. As long as it doesn't break off, thinking has a secure hold on possibility. Its insatiable aspect, its aversion being quickly and easily satisfied, refuses the foolish wisdom of resignation. Open thinking points beyond itself. Whatever has once been thought can be suppressed, forgotten, can vanish, but it cannot be denied that something of it survives. For thinking has the element of the universal. What once was thought cogently must be thought elsewhere, by others. This confidence accompanies even the most solitary and powerless thought. The happiness that dawns in the eye of the thinking person is the happiness of humanity. The universal tendency of oppression is opposed to thought as such. Thought is happiness, even where it defines unhappiness. By enunciating it, by this alone, happiness reaches into the universal unhappiness. Whoever does not let it atrophy has not resigned. Now, I want to quote something else, and this is from a gentleman by the name of Christopher Hampton, from an essay called Blake's Witness, Keeping the Divine Vision in Time of Trouble, in an anthology called The Ideology of the Text. And this is what one of the paragraphs, what he had to say, summarizing up William Blake, one of my heroes that I've quoted and will quote again and again. This is Christopher Hampton on Blake. He refused to be seduced or defeated by the operative powers that ruled his world. In an age of violence and perverted idealism, very like our own, he saw things deeply but clearly, and nothing, not neglect or failure or his increasing sense of isolation, could diminish that insight or destroy his happy confidence in himself or his assurance that he was fundamentally right in his commitment to and his vision of humanity. He was a fighter, and his concept of the New Jerusalem, grounded as it was on a dialectic of the contrary states, enabled him to stand firm against surrender and to generate a language of expectation, defiance, and struggle on which to build for a creative alternative to the bankrupt imperatives of the existing order. For him, the choice was clear. To labor in knowledge is to build up Jerusalem, and to despise knowledge is to despise Jerusalem and her builders. In other words, in a time of darkness and oppression, in a much less, even less enlightened age than our own, the late 18th and early 19th century, Blake could stand alone and not be broken. Finally, I want to add a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Duke Ellington. And this is an excerpt from a program he wrote for a concert of sacred music, 1965. This is Duke Ellington. In this world, we presume many ambitions. We make many observations, such as everyone's aloneness. There really are no categories, you know. Everyone is so alone, the basic, essential state of humankind. And B, the paradox that is communication, the built-in answer to that feeling of aloneness. Communication itself is what baffles the multitude. It is both so difficult and so simple. Of all men's fears, I think that men are most afraid of being what they are, in direct communication with the world at large. They fear reprisals, the most personal of which is that they won't be understood. Yet, every time God's children have thrown away fear in pursuit of honesty, trying to communicate themselves, understood or not, miracles have happened. That miracle may or may not happen for you, but don't let yourself be inhibited by fear in a hostile environment. Don't let that stop you from experiencing somewhere, somehow, and hopefully with someone, the immeasurably joyous expression of both love and intellect. And this is Ralph Dumain saying farewell to another installment of Studies in a Dying Culture. And thank you for listening. All right, very good. So do I have to write a summary for the website like I always